In the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a clay tablet sits in controlled storage. Its catalog number CBS 10673, roughly 4 inches across, covered in wedge-shaped marks that look almost like bird tracks pressed into dried mud. The tablet is cool to the touch when researchers handle it with cotton gloves. Its surface is slightly rough, where millennia of time have weathered the baked clay. This fragment is called the Eridu Genesis, and it contains the oldest written account of the flood. But that's not what makes it extraordinary. What makes it extraordinary is what it says came before the flood. A world that existed for so long that even the Sumerians, who recorded it, couldn't quite explain how long it had lasted. Before we go further, if you're settling in to explore this mystery, whether you're lying in bed in Tokyo, sitting in your car in Toronto, or walking through quiet streets in Berlin at 3 in the morning, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. There's something powerful about knowing we're all following this story together, across time zones and continents. What we're about to examine isn't folklore. It's not religious mythology designed to explain natural phenomena. It's documentation, preserved on clay tablets that survived fires, floods, and 4,000 years of burial, copied and recopied by scribes who believed they were transmitting something that mattered, something true. And when you line up these tablets chronologically and geographically, when you read what they actually say rather than what we assume they must mean, a pattern emerges that challenges everything we think we know about how civilization began. The story starts in 1906 in the ancient city of Nippur, in what is now Iraq. An American archaeologist named Herman Hilprecht was leading excavations through collapsed temples and residential quarters. His team had been digging for months, hauling baskets of clay fragments to sorting tables where scholars tried to piece together the puzzle of Mesopotamia's forgotten past. Most of what they found was predictable: tax receipts, business contracts, student exercises where young scribes practiced their writing over and over until their hands learned the muscle memory of pressing reed styluses into wet clay dot. Then someone brushed the dirt from a small prism, and everything changed. The text began with a line that sounded like poetry. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Hilprecht recognized the format immediately. This was a king list, the kind of chronological record that every ancient civilization kept. Egypt had lists of pharaohs stretching back through dynasties. Babylon would eventually compile its own royal chronologies. These were practical documents used to establish legitimacy, settle disputes over succession, and help scribes date legal contracts. But the Sumerian version was different. Hilprecht began translating the wedge-shaped signs. The first king's name was Alualim. The city was Eridu, and his reign length stopped Hilprecht cold. The signs were clear, pressed firmly into clay with absolute confidence. Alulim had reigned for 28,800 years. Not 28 years, not 280 years, 28,800 years. He checked his translation. Maybe he had misread a symbol. Maybe a scribe had made an error copying this tablet from an older version. But the cuneiform was unambiguous. The numerical notation was precise. The next entry was equally impossible. Alalga, the second king of Eridu, had ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, a man with the elaborate name Enmenlu, Anna, had reigned for 43,200 years. The list continued. 8 kings total in the city of Eridu, their combined reigns adding up to 241,200 years. Then the document moved to the next city, Bad Tibera. where 5 more kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. Then Larak, where a single king reigned for 28,800 years. Then Sippar, then Sharupak. 5 cities, 8 kings. An impossible span of time before something fundamental changed. And then, abruptly, the clay prisms. Neat columns of numbers were interrupted by a single devastating line. The flood swept over. Everything stopped. Everything ended. The text resumed with a phrase that would appear in every version of this document ever found. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Notice that word, again. Not lowered for the first time, but lowered again. As if kingship had descended once before, ruled through those impossible spans of years, and then been interrupted by water and catastrophe before being restored to a world that had to begin over. After that line, everything changed. The post-flood kings still had exaggerated reign lengths. Etana of Kish supposedly ruled for 1,500 years, which is absurd by modern standards. But 1,500 years is human-scale mythology. The kind of inflation you expect when great kings get their reigns amplified by legend. A ruler who governed for 50 years becomes 500 in the stories, told by descendants. But 28,000 years is something else entirely. That's not exaggeration, that's encoding. That's documentation of something that wasn't meant to be read as human biography at all. Hilprecht finished his translation and sat back, staring at the impossible numbers. He was a careful scholar, trained in the rigorous academic traditions of late 19th century philology. He knew that ancient scribes sometimes made mistakes. He knew that numbers could be corrupted through repeated copying. He knew that mythology often dressed itself as history to seem more authoritative. But this document didn't feel like a mistake or corruption or invention. It felt deliberate. The numbers were too precise, too consistent, too carefully calculated to be random fabrications. Over the following decades, more versions of the king list were discovered. Archaeologists found copies in Lhasa, in Ur, in Isin, in Babylon. Different scribes in different cities, in different centuries, all preserving the exact same impossible numbers. And when scholars examined the tablets closely, when they looked at the tiny corrections where scribes had caught their own errors and fixed them, they realized something remarkable. These ancient copyists had treated this document with reverence. When they made mistakes, they crossed them out and rewrote the passage correctly. They weren't careless. They weren't indifferent. They copied these impossible reign lengths with the same careful precision they used for astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. They were preserving something they believed mattered. But what? What could those numbers possibly mean? For over 50 years, scholars settled on the simplest explanation. The pre-flood section must be pure mythology. Symbolic ages representing cosmic eras before human history properly began. The kind of origin story that every culture invents to make itself seem ancient and legitimate. Case closed. Mystery solved. Except the Sumerians themselves never called it mythology. They cited those pre-flood kings in legal formulas and temple inscriptions as if they were historical precedents. They referenced the wisdom of Alulam's time and the laws established in the days of Enmenluana, as though these were real periods that had actually happened, not poetic inventions. Then, in the 1960s, something shifted. A new generation of researchers began looking at those impossible reign lengths not as errors or fantasies, but as data. And when you approach impossible numbers as data, you start looking for patterns. And the Sumerian king list has a pattern so clear, so mathematically elegant that once you see it, you can never read the document the same way again. Every single pre-flood rain length is a multiple of 3600. Every single one. The Sumerians had a special word for this number. They called it a shah. It appears in their astronomical texts, in their temple calculations, in cosmological inscriptions carved into stone meant to outlast empires. A shah was one of their fundamental units for measuring vast expanses of time. But a shah wasn't arbitrary. It was precisely 3600 years, and when scholars started dividing those impossible rain lengths by 3600, the king list transformed from nonsense into mathematics. Ululam, the first king of Eridu, had supposedly reigned for 28,800 years. Divide that by 3600 and you get 8. 8 shahs exactly. Alalga, the second king, ruled for 36,000 years. That's 10 shahs. Enmen-Luana, whose name means something like Lord of the Divine Powers of Heaven, reigned for 43,200 years. 12 shahs. The pattern holds across every entry. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is not mythology inflating human lifespans into cosmic ages. This is encoding. Someone was recording something using a specific mathematical system, and they were doing it with absolute precision. But encoding what the answer might lie in what the Sumerians were famous for beyond almost any other ancient civilization: astronomy. The Sumerians tracked the night sky with obsessive dedication. They recorded the movements of Venus across decades, noting when it appeared in the eastern sky before dawn, when it vanished behind the sun, when it emerged in the western sky after sunset. These observations required watching the same celestial patterns night after night, year after year, generation after generation, until the cycles became predictable, and Sumerian predictions were accurate, terrifyingly accurate. Modern astronomers have checked their Venus tablets against computer models of historical planetary positions, and the Sumerian observations are correct too within a single day across 21-year cycles. You don't achieve that level of precision by casual stargazing. You achieve it through institutional commitment, through continuous observation maintained across lifetimes, across centuries, across millennia. The same precision shows up in their eclipse predictions. The Sumerians recognized what astronomers now call the Saros cycle, an 18-year period after which lunar eclipses repeat in very similar patterns. To identify this cycle, you need to observe and record eclipses for decades. Then compare your records to find the underlying rhythm. It's not something one person can discover in a lifetime. It requires institutional memory, and institutional memory requires institutions, observatory schools, a system where knowledge gets passed from teacher to student, where records are maintained and compared across generations, where watching the sky isn't a hobby but a sacred responsibility. So here's the question that changes everything. What if those impossible rain lengths in the king list aren't recording how long individual kings lived? What if they're recording how long astronomical institutions operated? Think about it differently. Imagine the king list isn't saying, Ululam, the man reigned for 28,800 years. Imagine it saying the Eridu Observatory operated for 8 complete Shah cycles. 8 periods of 3,600 years of continuous astronomical observation, from its founding in some unimaginably distant past until the flood destroyed it. Suddenly, the numbers stop being impossible. They become ambitious, yes. They become a staggering claim about the antiquity of organized sky watching. But they're no longer absurd. They're just really, really old. This reading explains why the king list uses shars as its unit. You don't measure human lifespans in 3,600-year increments, but you might measure the operational lifetime of an observatory that way, especially if your entire culture organized time around celestial cycles and you needed a unit that could express cosmic timescales. It explains why the Sumerians copied these numbers so faithfully. They weren't preserving biography. They were preserving chronology, the institutional memory of when skywatching began, how long it continued, and when catastrophe ended it, and it explains the flood. The king list treats the flood as the moment when everything stopped. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again. Not when the first king died and the second king took over, but when an entire system collapsed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. If the pre-flood section records the operational life of astronomical observatories measuring time in shvars, then the flood becomes the event that destroyed those institutions. The waters didn't just kill people and wreck buildings. They severed continuity. They ended a system of knowledge preservation that had been running for tens of thousands of years. But did the flood actually happen? In the winter of 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley stood at the bottom of a trench beneath the ancient city of Ur. His team had been digging for months through collapsed buildings and ancient streets, hunting for the city's earliest occupation layers. His workers had been pulling up pottery fragments for weeks, pieces of simple bowls and storage jars, flint tools with edges still sharp enough to cut, charcoal from cooking fires that had burned 5,000 years ago. Then abruptly, the artifacts stopped. The workers hit clean clay, smooth, uniform, sterile, no pottery, no tools, no charcoal, no trace of human presence whatsoever. Woolley assumed they had reached virgin soil, the natural earth beneath which nothing human existed. He was about to call the excavation complete when something made him pause. He told his workers to keep digging, through the clean clay, through the sterile layer, down into what should have been nothing but geological deposits. They dug 2.5 meters, 8 feet of clay with no artifacts, no occupation debris, no sign that humans had ever existed. And then, at the bottom of that impossible thickness of sterile earth, the artifacts began again. Pottery, but different pottery, different shapes, different decorative patterns, different firing techniques. Beneath the flood layer lay another city, another culture, another world entirely. Something had buried it under 8 feet of water, deposited silt. Something sudden and catastrophic enough to scour the landscape clean, leaving nothing but mud. And then, after the waters receded, after the clay dried and hardened, a new civilization had built directly on top of the remains. When Woolley published his findings, the timing was extraordinary. The flood layer at Ur dated to roughly 2,900 years before the Common Era, right around the time when the Sumerian king list describes kingship being lowered from heaven again after the waters swept over. The timing wasn't approximate. It was exact, but Ur wasn't the only site. At Shuruppak, the city where the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra had supposedly ruled according to myth, excavators found the same sterile clay layer, roughly 2 meters thick, deposited between distinct occupation levels. At Kish, another major Sumerian center, the pattern repeated. Artifacts, flood, silt, artifacts. At Eridu, the city where the king list claims kingship first descended from heaven, archaeologists uncovered evidence of abandonment and reconstruction following a major flooding event. Not every Sumerian site shows this layer. Some cities sat on higher ground that the waters never reached, but across the low-lying plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge, the geological record is consistent. Around 2,900 years before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened. Water came, not gradually, not seasonally, but suddenly and completely. The flood wasn't global. It didn't cover mountains. But within the boundaries of Mesopotamian experience, within the world the Sumerians knew, it was total. Every city along the river valleys submerged. Every field drowned. Every settlement destroyed or abandoned. For people whose entire universe consisted of the land between two rivers, the flood was the end of the world. The 8 feet of sterile clay at Ur represents more than physical destruction. It represents the severing of continuity. Imagine what gets lost when a civilization stops for even a single generation. Libraries that don't get copied. Teachers who die before passing on specialized knowledge. Techniques that require apprenticeship and demonstration. Records that exist only in a single archive. Now imagine that interruption lasting not one generation, but several. The King lists pre-flood section with its astronomical observations spanning hundreds of thousands of years would have required continuous institutional operation. Observatories where records were kept and compared. Schools where calculation methods were taught. A stable civilization supporting specialists who could dedicate their lives to watching the sky. The flood destroyed that continuity. Not necessarily the knowledge itself, because some of it clearly survived in fragmentary form, but the institutions, the unbroken chain of observation and record-keeping, the system. And when the Sumerians rebuilt, when they established new cities and new temples and new schools, they were working from fragments, trying to restore what had been lost, trying to remember what the world before the waters had known. That's why their texts keep using that word. Restoration, not invention, not discovery. Restoration of what was before. But here's where the mystery deepens. If the Sumerians were restoring knowledge from before the flood, how did they know what to restore? When archaeologists excavate the earliest substantial Sumerian layers, they don't find primitive beginnings. They find sophistication, mathematics that still governs how we measure time, astronomy accurate enough to predict celestial events, medicine that actually works, legal systems nuanced enough to handle complex disputes, architecture aligned to cosmic precision. All of it present from the start, all of it too advanced to have been invented recently. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, the same system we still use when we divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees. This isn't a simple counting system. It's an elegant mathematical framework where 60 can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. But base 60 doesn't emerge naturally. Most cultures count on their fingers and develop base 10 systems. The Sumerians have no earlier tablets showing experimentation with different number bases. Base 60 is simply there in the earliest mathematical texts, already embedded in everything they calculate. Their astronomy shows the same impossible sophistication. They tracked Venus with obsessive precision. They predicted eclipse cycles. They compiled constellation lists. One tablet shows an approximation of the square root of 2 calculated to 6 decimal places. This level of precision supposedly wasn't achieved again until Greek mathematicians worked on irrational numbers 2,000 years later. Their medical knowledge is equally startling. Clay tablets listing remedies don't read like early experiments in healing. They read like reference manuals compiled from established practice. Thyme for respiratory infections. Willow bark for pain, which modern medicine confirmed contains the active ingredient in aspirin. The texts specify dosages, preparation methods, and expected outcomes with clinical precision, and running through all of this, through their mathematical texts and astronomical tables and medical prescriptions, is a phrase that appears over and over, from distant days. Not we invented this, not our teachers discovered this, but from distant days, a passive construction that places the origin outside living memory. The Sumerians consistently present themselves not as inventors, but as custodians, caretakers of knowledge that came from somewhere else, from some time earlier, from people whose names had already been lost. They were restoring what the flood had interrupted, rebuilding on top of ruins, both physical and intellectual. So, if the Sumerians inherited their sophistication from the world before the flood, who established that knowledge in the first place? Who were the ancestors they kept referencing? Who were the teachers from distant days? The king list might give us the answer. Not in the impossible lifespans, which we now understand as astronomical cycles, but in the names themselves. Alulim, Al-Algaran, and Menluana. Names that the Sumerians preserved with reverence, copying them faithfully across 1,000 years. What if those weren't the names of individual kings at all? What if they were names of eras? Periods of time labeled by survivors trying to organize fragments of a shattered past. In hymns and inscriptions across multiple cities, these pre-flood kings are referenced not as gods, not as symbolic figures, but as historical precedents. Legal formulas invoke the days of Alulim as a golden age of justice. Temple dedications mention the wisdom established in the time of Enmenlu-Ana. These weren't abstract mythological eras. They were cited as specific periods when certain institutions, laws, and practices were established. Practices that later Sumerian civilization claimed to be restoring, not inventing. What if the Alulim period simply means the first era of organized astronomical observation at Eridu? 28,800 years. The founding period when skywatching became institutionalized. Enmenlu-Ana, whose name means Lord of the divine powers of heaven, might not be a person. It might be the era when celestial observation reached a particular level of sophistication. 12 Shahs. 43,200 years. Perhaps this was when eclipse prediction became reliable, when the movements of planets were first accurately charted. This reading transforms the king list from impossible biography into plausible chronology. Not a record of superhuman individuals, but a record of institutional continuity. The document isn't saying Alulim, the man lived for 28,800 years. It's saying the Alulim period, the era of the Eridu observatories founding and early operation, encompassed 8 complete Shah cycles before transitioning into the next phase. But this immediately raises the question we've been circling since the beginning. Who founded these institutions? Who established the Eridu Observatory in the first place? Who began the count that would eventually accumulate to 8 Shahs, 10 Shahs, 12 Shahs, before the waters came and swept it all away? The Sumerians had an answer. They wrote it down in thousands of tablets. They carved it into temple walls. They never stopped talking about who taught them, who gave them knowledge, who established the foundations of civilization that the Sumerians were desperately trying to restore after the flood. They called them the Anunnaki. The name appears everywhere in Sumerian literature. The great gods who decree fate, the divine assembly who judge humanity, the ones who came from heaven to establish order on earth. Modern readers dismiss them as mythology, as primitive people inventing gods to explain natural phenomena. But the Sumerians never described the Anunnaki as distant cosmic forces. They described them as active participants, teachers, instructors, beings, who walked among humans and showed them how to measure the stars. In creation myths, the Anunnaki don't speak the world into existence. They work, they dig canals, they build temples, they organize agriculture, and when they grow tired of the labor, they create humans to help maintain what they've established, not through divine miracle, but through a process the texts describe with procedural detail. Mixing, testing, adjusting, trial and error. These stories read less like theology and more like documentation, as though the Sumerians were trying to preserve memory of actual events using the only vocabulary available to them, the vocabulary of gods and divine action, because they had no other framework for describing beings who possessed knowledge far beyond what human civilization had yet achieved. What if the Anunnaki weren't mythological at all? What if they were the survivors of the pre-flood world, the ones who established the observatories that ran for 241,000 years, the ones who developed base 60 mathematics and bronze metallurgy and sophistication medicine? And what if after the waters receded, after the observatories were ruined and the continuous chain of observation was broken, those survivors taught the next generation what they could remember, passed down fragments of knowledge, established new schools and temples, tried to restore what had been lost. Over generations, as memory faded and distance grew, those teachers would have been elevated, mythologized, transformed from human survivors with advanced knowledge into divine beings with cosmic authority. Their teachings would have become sacred wisdom. Their names would have become invocations. And here's what makes this particularly striking. These teacher figures who descend from the heavens to instruct humanity don't appear only in Sumerian texts. They appear everywhere, across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. In Egypt, the Neteru are described in temple inscriptions as teachers who arrived in pre-dynastic times to establish law, agriculture, and astronomy. In Hindu tradition, the Devas descend periodically to instruct humanity during transitions between cosmic ages. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brings writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. The same portfolio attributed to Enki in Sumerian texts. Independent invention should produce more variation. If every culture spontaneously generated teacher from the sky myths, we'd expect wildly different details. But the pattern holds. Anthropomorphic figures with knowledge arrive from elsewhere. They interact with humanity. They provide foundational skills that enable civilization. Then they either depart or are removed by catastrophe, leaving humans to continue alone with the fragments they've been given. This consistency across unrelated cultures suggests something deeper than coincidence. Either these stories all descend from a single ancestral myth that spread impossibly far, or they're all preserving memory of something that actually happened, something significant enough that every culture felt compelled to remember it. The Sumerians might have been closest to the source, closest to the original event, which is why their accounts retain details that feel almost procedural, why their creation myths include trial and error, why their teachers have specific names and specific functions rather than vague cosmic attributes. If the Anunnaki were survivors of the pre-flood world, people who possessed knowledge accumulated over the 241,000 years that the observatories operated, then, after the catastrophe, they would have been the only ones who remembered. The only ones who understood base 60 mathematics and astronomical cycles and agricultural management. They would have taught the next generation, established new schools, founded new temples, and over time, as generations passed and distance grew between the teachers and their descendants, those teachers would have been remembered as gods because their knowledge seemed divine compared to what the survivors possessed. This is how ancestor worship works everywhere. Founders become legends. Teachers become divinities. But underneath the mythology, fragments of truth persist. The knowledge itself survives, even when memory of where it came from grows hazy. So where does this leave us? We've examined the tablets. We've looked at the king list's impossible numbers and discovered they might encode astronomical observation periods measured in We've traced the flood through geological evidence and found it really happened at exactly the time the texts describe. We've documented sophisticated Sumerian knowledge that appeared too suddenly to have been recently invented. We've noted the consistent references to restoration rather than invention, to knowledge from distant days, to teachers who established what came before. And we've observed similar teacher myths across unrelated cultures worldwide. 3 interpretations present themselves. First, pure mythology. The mainstream view reads these texts as religious literature serving theological and political functions. The Anunnaki represent natural forces personified as deities. The impossible rain lengths are symbolic. The sophisticated knowledge developed gradually, and we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages. The flood was natural disaster interpreted through religious frameworks. This interpretation has the weight of scholarship behind it and requires no extraordinary assumptions. Second, encoded wisdom. A middle position reads the texts as containing legitimate ancient knowledge encoded in symbolic language. The Anunnaki represent cosmic principles. The rain lengths encode astronomical cycles we haven't fully decoded. The creation myths preserve understanding of natural laws. The texts function as teaching literature, preserving practical knowledge in narrative form that could survive across generations. This interpretation takes the texts seriously while avoiding literal supernatural claims. Third, historical documentation. The alternative framework takes the texts closer to face value. They document real events involving real entities called Anunnaki who governed Sumerian civilization, whose observatories operated for periods measured in who survived the flood and taught subsequent generations, creating the sophisticated knowledge base that appeared so suddenly in Sumerian culture. This interpretation requires accepting that something we don't fully understand happened in humanity's deep past. Which interpretation is correct? The honest answer is, we don't know. Each framework makes sense according to its own assumptions. What we can say with confidence is that the texts exist. They describe a world before the flood when institutions operated for impossibly long periods. They document catastrophic destruction that actually happened. They preserve consistent patterns across multiple independent sources. They were taken seriously enough that copies were made for over 1,000 years. And they describe knowledge that appeared in Sumerian civilization with remarkable suddenness and sophistication. Whether that knowledge came from mythological gods, from encoded ancient wisdom, or from survivors of a pre-flood civilization, the Sumerians themselves were clear about one thing. They didn't invent it. They restored it. They preserved it. They passed it forward from distant days, pressing their testimony into wet clay, firing it hard and permanent, so that future generations might understand what came before the cities, before the kingship they knew, before the flood that divided all time into two eras. In museum vaults across the world, the tablets wait. The same temperature, the same humidity, the same patient silence they've held for millennia. And on their surfaces, pressed into clay by hands that understood they were preserving something precious, the wedge marks still ask their question. What happened before? What was lost when the waters came? What knowledge did the survivors carry forward? What were they trying so desperately to tell us? The Sumerian king list records that before the flood, before Ululam and his 28,800-year reign, kingship descended from heaven. It doesn't explain what that means. It doesn't describe where heaven was or who did the lowering. It simply states it as fact, the way you'd record any administrative data, and then it lists the names, the cities, the impossible spans of time, preserving them with mathematical precision so that someday someone might understand what those numbers really mean. Did the first kings really rule for 28,000 years? No, no human lives that long. But did institutions they founded operate for 8 shahs? Did observatories track the stars for spans of time so vast that even the Sumerians could only record them as numbers that seemed impossible? Did knowledge accumulate across timescales we can barely imagine? Did catastrophe destroy that continuity, forcing survivors to restore civilization from fragments? Did teachers whose names became legends pass forward what they could remember of the world before? The clay doesn't answer definitively. It only preserves the question, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Not certainty, but invitation. Not conclusion, but beginning. The tablets have spoken. The evidence has been examined. The patterns are there for anyone willing to look closely enough, question carefully enough, and consider seriously enough what these ancient voices were trying to preserve. The story doesn't end. It opens, and the choice of how to read it, what to do with it, whether to file it away as interesting mythology or let it reshape how you understand where we came from, that choice belongs to you. Somewhere in the darkness where you're listening now, wherever in the world that might be, the same stars the Sumerians tracked still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The same cycles they measured in shahs still turn, and the same question they pressed into clay still waits for an answer. What happened before? Sleep now, and let the mystery remain. Let the clay remember for you. Let the impossible numbers hold their secrets a little longer, because some questions are more valuable unanswered. Some mysteries are worth preserving, and some stories from distant days deserve to be carried forward, generation after generation, exactly as the Sumerians carried them, not because we understand them fully, but because somewhere, pressed into clay and fired hard against time, the truth might be waiting for the moment we're finally ready to hear it.